Chapter 7, Mishnah 2. The Mishnah teaches what must be done if a field being sold is measured and found to be either larger or smaller than the agreed upon size. As in the previous Mishnah, the case used as an example is the sale of a base core, a field of 180 kav. The laws that apply depend on what language the seller used when making the sale. If the seller said, "I am selling you a base core of earth as measured by the line," this language means that he intended to sell a field that measures exactly 180 kav. Therefore, if the field measures even a little bit less than this, he must deduct from the sale price. And if there was even a little bit of extra land, the buyer must give back, see Mishnah below. But if the seller said, "I am selling you a base core of earth, a bit less or a bit more," then even if the measure of the field is a quarter kav per se'ah, less or a quarter kav per se'ah more than it should be, that is, the field is either up to 7.5 kav larger or smaller than the agreed upon base core, a base core of 30 se'ah, and 30 and a fourth kav equals 7.5 kav, the buyer keeps the field as it is and no refund is made. Since the seller stated that he was selling a field that was more or less the size of a base core, a discrepancy of up to 7.5 kavs either way, which is 1/24th of the total, or about 4.2%, is acceptable, and the sale stands without adjustment of the price. However, if the missing or extra land is more than this, that is more than 7.5 kav per base core, then we make a reckoning of how much is missing or extra, and make an adjustment to the sale as follows. If the land is measured and found to be smaller than required, even a bit smaller in the Mishnah's first case, where the seller said that he was selling exactly a base core, and more than 7.5 kav per base core smaller in the Mishnah's second case, where he said that he was selling a base core more or less, the seller must refund some of the sale price to the buyer. However, when there is more land than a base core, even a bit extra in the Mishnah's first case, and more than 7.5 kav extra in the second case, the way the sale is adjusted depends upon what the seller wants to do, as the Mishnah will explain. What must the buyer return to the seller if the land is larger than a base core? Money. That is, the buyer must pay the seller additional money for the extra land, which the buyer then keeps along with the rest of the field. But if the seller wants him to return the extra land instead, the buyer must return the extra land to him. The seller has no choice to either. The seller has the choice to either take back the extra land or be paid for it. The Mishnah explains why the sages gave this option to the seller. And why did they say that the buyer must return additional money to the seller for extra land, even though the buyer had not agreed to buy more than a base core? In order to strengthen the hand of the seller, so he will not be left with a very small parcel of land that will be useless to him. In order to make sure that the seller will not suffer this financial loss, the sages require the buyer to purchase the additional land if that is what the seller wants. However, the seller does not have this option if the amount of land is large enough to be useful on its own. Because this option of selling the extra land is given to the seller only to protect him from loss, the law is that if the extra land that is left after the full base core has been measured is 9 kav or more, or if the land being sold is not a grain field but a garden, if the extra land is at least a half kav in size, and according to Rabbi Akiva, if the extra garden land is at least a quarter kav inside, the buyer returns the extra land to the seller, and we do not make him buy it. Since a grain field that is 9 kav or larger can be planted on its own, the seller can keep the extra land without suffering a loss, and there is no reason to make the buyer buy it. In the case of a garden as well, since a garden that is half a kav in size, or according to Rabbi Akiva, even a garden that is a quarter kav in size, is large enough to be useful, the buyer returns the extra land and does not have to buy it. The final law of the Mishnah makes clear that although a discrepancy of up to 7.5 kav per base core is acceptable when the seller said that the field was more or less a base core, this does not mean that the first 7.5 kav of extra land is kept by the buyer if the amount of extra land is greater than this. And it is not only the land that is in excess of the quarter kav per se'ah, that is the extra land above and beyond 7.5 kavs per base core, that the buyer must return. Rather, he must return all of the excess land. If the amount of extra land is more than 7.5 kav, and a reckoning must be made, the seller forgives nothing, and all of the extra land must be returned to him, or paid for, depending on exactly how much extra land there is, as the Mishnah explained above.